All right, good evening, everybody. We're going to call to order the Thursday, July 19th, 2018 meeting of the Delta Protection Commission. And to start us off with the flag salute, Mr. Van Silden, would you lead us in the pledge, please?
Sure. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, thank you for that. So our chairman, our esteemed chairman is, I believe he's on vacation, so I'm going to substitute in this evening. So to start us off, our commission clerk, Ms. Medina, would you take the roll, please?
Yes. Vice Chair Villegas.
Here.
Commissioner Wynn. Commissioner Cott.
Here.
Commissioner Loftus.
Here.
Commissioner Nomalini.
Here.
Commissioner Van Lobensel's.
Here.
Commissioner Flournoy.
Here.
Commissioner Eddy.
Here.
And Commissioner Roberts.
Here.
And we have a quorum
All right.
at 8.
All right, thank you very much. So to get started, I wanted to recognize Michael Roberts, who was sworn in just before the meeting, and he will be the new primary alternate for Secretary Laird. So welcome, and if you wanted to say a few words, or it's up to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I will just say thanks for having me as part of this effort. I'm excited to join. This is a big learning curve for me to get up to speed on what you all have been working on, but I got about halfway through my my homework, the very large binder packet that I was given, so I have some idea what y'all are up to. So just very happy to be a part of the effort.
All right, very good. Well, welcome. All right, so in the event that there's interest in public comment, we have a public comment cards, I think, up here on the table somewhere, right, Eric?
At the sign-in table.
They're on the
At
back.
the sign-in table, so make sure that you take advantage of that. If you plan to speak on items that are either on the agenda or not, either way, we'd like to have a speaker slip submitted, so take advantage of that. So that takes us to, and I don't have any slips to speak at the moment that are items not on the agenda, unless I see a raise of a hand. I'm going to assume there's not at the moment, and that'll take us to item 4, which is consent agenda. So we're looking for an approval of the meeting minutes from the May 17th meeting.
Would you like a motion to
I would
approve
love a motion.
minutes from May 17th? I make that motion.
All right, so we have a motion on the table, and we still need a second.
Second.
All right, so I think we have a second at the end of the table. Very good. So all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed or abstentions? Seeing none, so we've got our minutes approved from the last meeting. So that takes us to our regular agenda item. Item 5 is receive the executive director report, and that's you, Eric.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And for commissioners, but also for audience members, the microphones are more for recording our meeting than they are for amplification. So if you could keep the mic close, we'll not blow out the audience, but it will help greatly with the audio recording that we'll post online following the meeting. And we actually have people that download that and listen to it, so it's a helpful record of our meeting. As per usual, I won't cover every item in my executive director report. I want to highlight about half of the items. I'm happy to answer questions about anything I don't touch on or even anything that's not included in the report. But let me start with a little bit about our land use and resource management plan update. The Commission's probably aware that we're updating our 2010 LURMP. Our program manager, Melinda Doran's been very diligently working on this. What we anticipate and what I wanted to include in this report was how we see next steps in this process. And at this point, we believe we'll have a public draft ready to go out in September, so just a few months down the road. We've already been in discussion with the Delta Protection Advisory Committee. You'll hear from Chair Mark Pruner in just a moment. They have offered to host public meetings during the public comment period, which would be a great way to get both DPAC involved and provide the public an opportunity to comment. We do have a commission subcommittee that consists of 4 commission members, and we would like to convene that group in September, October. I believe that Commissioner Nguyen will be chairing that effort, and Commissioner Loftus, and I apologize, I misspelled Commissioner Loftus's name. I frequently forget the H. But Commissioner Ferguson and Lester Moffitt had also volunteered to be a part of that. And then, although this is more speculative, we think the final land use plan would come before the commission at the January 2019 meeting. And let me welcome Senator Galgiani to the meeting. Appreciate that, Senator. And then we have to go through a Office of Administrative Law proceeding that will take us through the first part of 2019. More full briefing on that at the next commission meeting, but I just wanted to lay that out. If there are any concerns about any of that, any desire for commission members to participate in the commission subcommittee, these are all publicly noticed meetings, so we can add as many commission members as we would like to that. But for the time being, it was appointed as a committee of 4. The second item I wanted to update you on is the Delta Heritage Forum. In about 14 hours or 15 hours in this very room, we'll be convening the Delta Heritage Forum. And there is a copy of that program in front of commission members. I had it here a moment ago, but I don't have it now. That will lay out the program we'll have tomorrow. This is an inaugural effort of the commission. It's an attempt to recognize that we're supporting and wanting to promote both historic preservation, but also the cultural values that are so rich throughout the Delta region. And so for the first time, we'll bring together a lot of people. We've got some great speakers lined up to present, and we're looking forward to a really good discussion. We'll have a healthy size audience. It'll be a larger crowd than is at our commission meeting tonight, and we're just looking forward to a lot of good exchange on that issue, both for the Delta and the Carquinez Strait, which is a part of the proposed National Heritage Area for the Delta. Moving on to the second page, the agritourism and cultural tourism study that we have kicked off, and I think I've only briefly mentioned this to the commission, but part of that study is actually surveying people who attend events in the Delta. And so far, we've conducted surveys at the Lock Spring Festival in May, but we'll have a survey team out at the Cortland Pear Fair. That's coming up in just a couple of short weeks, and then additional events in Clarksburg and Rio Vista going into the fall. And we'll conclude that study by summertime next year. But the focus is on why do people come to events in the Delta, what would make them more likely to come to events, with a real emphasis on agritourism especially. Moving on to the Central Delta Corridor Strategy, and this is an effort that the Delta Conservancy is leading. It's an attempt to develop a conservation strategy for about 50,000 acres of land that's either owned by public agencies or was funded by public agencies. And that is an arc that stretches in the north from Cosumnes River Preserve and Stone Lakes National Wildlife Refuge, and it swings down through Nature Conservancy-owned lands on McCormick-Williamson and Staten Island. DWR owns much of Twitchell and Sherman Islands, and then State Parks has some properties, including Frank's Tract, which we'll have a presentation on at the next commission meeting. And then, of course, the recent acquisition by Metropolitan Water District of 4 islands toward the southern end of that arc. And so the intention is, it's not that all of these acres are going to be restored overnight. We know that takes a long time. And what very likely will come out of this is a plan that certainly envisions continued farming throughout this broad area, but also where there are opportunities to do some targeted restoration efforts. And we're participating to try to represent Delta interests. We're encouraging others that have an interest in this to participate as well. Moving on to the State Water Resources Control Board, and commission members are probably aware that just a couple of weeks ago, the state board published a notice both releasing the final plan amendments for the San Joaquin River segment of the Basin Water Quality Plan, and also releasing a draft, what they call substitute environmental document for the Sacramento River. Actually, I apologize, I think I got that wrong. For the Sacramento River system, they released a, basically their first step in how they intend to move forward. The big controversy in this, of course, is the whole notion of unimpaired flows. The board had originally talked about a 40 to 60% unimpaired flow requirement in the San Joaquin River and its tributaries. And they did finalize, or they're proposing a final document that does include that 40% figure. And they're looking at similar flow objectives for the Sacramento River part of the system. Of particular note in this, and something that the commission commented on, was raising the salinity objective in the South Delta to a year-round salinity objective of 1.0. And I always forget the measurement. Our water quality friends can add that. But basically, at times of the year currently, it's lower than that, which is better for water quality. This would raise that objective to a year-round standard, and that would be certainly to the detriment of Delta water quality in the South Delta for that window of time that's currently at a lower standard. We've commented on this before. We plan to comment again with a particular focus on that salinity objective number. Oh, here it is. The board also released the Sacramento / Delta framework. So not just the framework for the Sacramento River, but for the rivers that flow directly into the Delta, the McCullum, the Cosumnes, and the Calaveras rivers. Moving on to a brief administrative update, the adopted fiscal year 18-19 budget that we're 19 days into included stable funding for the commission. In addition, there were 2 funding augmentations related to Delta Recreation. The first is to prepare a master plan for the Great California Delta Trail, and that's kind of the succession of planning efforts. We're currently wrapping up a blueprint for the eastern part of the Delta, having earlier completed the blueprint for the western part of the Delta. And then the second funding augmentation was for us to take a fresh look at the recreation chapter of the Economic Sustainability Plan. That's a report that is supposed to be updated every 5 years. We were not successful in obtaining full funding to update the entirety of the plan, so we did receive funding for the ag section update. That's something we're well along with. And now we have funding to update the recreation component of the plan. So maybe by the time we're on a 10-year cycle, we'll have updated all chapters of it through this piecemeal approach. But we're pleased to at least be focusing on the 2 main cornerstones of the Delta economy. Of course, agriculture being the largest, but recreation also making a strong contribution. And then related to the budget, and I think everyone has heard about this, but there was a budget trailer bill that was enacted that has a small change related to our Great California Delta Trail, nothing controversial. But the big news in that trailer bill was that the Delta Levee Subvention Program cost share at the 75% state, 25% local level, which was due to expire on July 1st, that provision was removed, the sunset provision, I should say, was removed from the statute entirely. So now we have a Delta Levee Subvention Program that provides up to 75% state funding with a 25% local match. But it also eliminated the ability to pay provision, which was problematic. And as opposed to the recommendation that the Delta Stewardship Council made in their Delta Levy Investment Strategy, the legislation did not raise the per-mile deductible for rural levies. That's the upfront payment that the local district would make before they can receive any reimbursement. They did increase the deductible for urban levies, which presumably have a much greater ability to raise funding for their efforts. So all in all, I think people who work in this area in the Delta would say it was a really good outcome for resolving that issue we've certainly talked about at this commission for several years now. And so that's a real relief to have that resolved. Finally, we have a bunch of fresh student faces in our office this summer, and I want to specifically introduce Emma Forrester, who's here tonight. If you could wave or stand up, Emma. And Ivy Mock as well. And they're both students at Emma at CSU Sonoma, Ivy at CSU Sacramento. And then we have a couple of other students that are coming in and out, but we'll have a lot of good student assistants with us, and we always appreciate that. So I wanted to acknowledge that. We ended the fiscal year in a very good shape. We didn't spend the commission's entire budget, but we got pretty close. Not that that should ever be a goal, but we don't want that to be noted year after year and then suffer the consequences. A lot of that was due to the fact that we were not fully staffed through a portion of the year, and fingers crossed, we are fully staffed now, and hopefully that continues throughout the calendar year. So unless there are any questions, Mr. Chair, should cover it for my report.
All right, thank you. Thank you for the report, Eric. Are there any questions on any aspects of the report? Nope, seeing none. Okay, that takes care of item 5. That takes us to item 6, which is the DPAC report. So Chair Mark Pruner will present the report on behalf of the DPAC. Is that the plan? Yep.
That's the plan. I feel like I'm out here in the wilderness. Wow. I guess where we are. We met a couple weeks ago. I want to especially acknowledge to the commission Erik's excellent work. We've asked Erik now for the second time to tell us what staff is doing. And I can't recall the number of pages in the report. I'm going to say it's about 7 or so. Erik can correct me if I'm wrong. But Erik took the time and went through in great detail to describe everything that staff is doing. That was incredibly helpful to us who live in the Delta to know what staff is doing. And I know that he's incorporating that, I think, in his reports to you as well. But that's kind of my roundabout way of thanking Erik and saying he takes our effort seriously. He's at every one of our meetings. He provides us with substantive input, sometimes telling us if he disagrees with the direction that we're going. And we absolutely listen to everything he's got to say. Number 2, as you know, you've got the Land Use Resource Management Plan update coming along, and we discussed a plan in general for your advisory committee to go out to the Delta, because we recognize it's not easy, it's not convenient for folks that are in the Delta to come to these meetings, and applaud you for moving the meetings around. That's very important. But we want to take the burden on ourselves, thinking about a comment that your chair made when the DPAC was first formed, that we want to seriously take our responsibility to go out into the Delta, solicit comment, and bring that back for your consideration. So we're taking steps in that regard and move that forward. We listened to the projects by the leadership class or looked at a spreadsheet, which is helpful to keep us reminded of the great work that each of the leadership classes has done in thinking and coming up with projects that are helpful to the Delta. Last time, I gave you a real quick briefing on a concept that we're working on and we continue to work on, and that is to take a relook at the statutory language, specifically Water Code Section 85054 and 85020, which says that the co-equal goals must be accomplished. That means they must be done in a way that enhances the Delta, not as a separate chapter, not as an appendix, and not as some volume somewhere else. So we're developing what we want to be a thoughtful recommendation to you, backed up with some background to ask you to propose to the Delta Stewardship Council and other folks, but primarily the Delta Stewardship Council in its constant updating and its new updating of the Delta plan, not to treat Delta's place as something that takes place in Chapter 5, separate from ecosystem restoration, separate from water conveyance, so that the reader thinks about and the reader knows, and it forces the Delta Stewardship Council to focus on those two areas in an integrated way with Delta as place and in a manner that enhances and protects the unique Delta values. So that's a big long sentence somewhere in there, but the point is we think that's a pretty fundamental matter that has been, it's in the statute. We know that Senator Wolk worked very hard to make sure that language was in the statute. We don't quite think that language is being carried out as it was intended in the current documents. So it's an important thing. We're going to try to bring that to you hopefully at your next meeting, hopefully, and bring that forward. And last and not quite within DPAC bailiwick, I have had the privilege of attending 2 meetings in the town of Hood, thanks to your staff, Blake in particular, who's called together people in Hood and said, what would you like? And I think out of that process and those discussions, Hood is coming together and Hood is organizing and Hood is beginning to think about what they would like for their future. And I know at least 3 members of the community, 4 members, I'm sorry, the community are here knowing that you're just down the road. And so I think this is their first time at any meeting of yours. So I'm incredibly excited that Hood, which is right in the middle, in the bullseye of the proposed project, is starting to get involved thanks to effort of the commission and staff. So I appreciate that very much. With that, that's my report. If any questions, I'd love to hear them. But
Okay, well, thank you, Mark, for the report. Are there any questions of Mark's report at this point?
Thank you
Seeing
very
none?
much.
Very good, thank you, Mark. All right, so this is just receive and file. There's no action necessary by the commission, so that moves us on to item 7, which is a report on the crop evapotranspiration in the Delta.
Great, and Mr. Chair, if I could just provide a real brief introduction to this before I invite the speakers up. This issue of estimating crop evapotranspiration in the Delta, it's important because there are requirements in state law to measure diversions in the Delta. That can be very costly to do when you have a number of different diversion points. People trying to implement this have had a lot of challenges. If we can figure out a way to get to a different method of measuring what truly gets used by agriculture in the Delta, and because the Delta is basically an open system when it comes to water, you put the water on, the crops use what they need, and what doesn't get used by the crops goes back to the Delta water system. This is a real promising method to get to a different form of measurement. And I'm probably stealing Michael George's thunder, so I'm just going to stop it there. But the Delta Watermaster, Michael George, we hear from him regularly at this commission. He convened this effort to take a deep dive into looking at different methods of estimating this. The commission did some early work on this going back 4 years now. Commission's had a long interest in this. We've provided partial funding for the study that will be discussed this evening. But with that, I will introduce our Delta Watermaster, Michael George, and I'll let him introduce our other 2 speakers.
Great. Thank you, Eric, and thank you for inviting me back and bring a couple of colleagues here who actually know a lot about the subject that we're going to talk about. So, as you know, we launched this study to compare a variety of different methods for estimating crop consumptive use in the Delta. And really, the effort that we took over was standing on the shoulders of the commission who funded the original proof of concept work. So our office, the Office of Delta Watermaster, managed this process, which we'll be talking about, but a lot of it was done under contract with the Center for Watershed Science. So Dr. J. Lund and Jesse Jankowski of the center are going to be up here to talk about some of the technical issues. I want to give you just an overview of what we want to talk about. I'll go quickly through the first part and then turn it over to the smart guys to tell you what we found out. But some background on the origin and why we started this study, who participated and kind of why, how the research was organized in the first place, what did we find out, and then what are the potential implications for what we found out? How's it going to be applied? What difference is it going to make? And then finally, what's next? Because as Dr. Lund always likes to say, the more you know, the more you want to know. And there's always the Marin factor, more research needed. So the challenge, as you know, because you did fund the original proof of concept work here, is that we don't have accurate and timely information about the largest use of water in the Delta, which is for agricultural crop cultivation. There is a lot of work being done to try and get at that issue because, as Erik said, it's a very important issue, and it's particularly important for managing the Delta, managing water in the Delta, and for particularly managing the Delta in times of shortage. So it's inherently difficult because the Delta itself is big, it's varied, it's different, it's lots of different parts. Most of the models that we have and most of the ways regulators and others think about the Delta often looks at the Delta as kind of a black box. Some water in, some water out, something happened in the middle, but we don't really know what. So we're trying to get a better handle on that, understand that land use and crop use on that land changes pretty rapidly, and that's one of the things that I would say I was surprised at. This is a 2-year study. The amount of change in that 2 years, 2015, a bad drought year, 2016, closer to an average year, dramatic changes, much more than certainly I'd anticipated. And with that as a window, we've certainly understood that that is something that happens all the time. It's pretty dynamic. Now there is a movement toward more permanent crops, so that dynamism may actually slow down in parts of the Delta over time. But we're trying to get beyond the black box, trying to crack it open, understand what's going on inside. So it's particularly important in times of shortage. We found out in 2015 that the main mechanism that is used in the models called Delta Island consumptive use isn't really helpful at the ends, at the tail of the bell curve. So if you've got a bell curve of water years, in the belly of the curve, the Delta Island consumptive use mechanism works pretty well. At the real wet end of the curve, like 2017, it kind of doesn't matter because there's so much water in the system that the amount that is consumed in the Delta is not critical. But of course, at that other end of the bell curve, at that tail end where there's not enough water, that's where it's really critical and where our understanding and our models really broke down in 2014 and 2015. Because when you look at the Delta as a mass balance area, you miss what's going on inside. It's important, therefore, for export management. How much water can be exported safely from the Delta has a lot to do with how much water needs to be used to water the crops that are being grown in the Delta. From my perspective, for water rights administration, enforcement of the water rights orders and so forth in the Delta, it's a critical item to know. And obviously, for those who are planning agriculture and how they're going to manage their crops, it's important to know. And going into the drought, we really had information that lagged a long way. So we get it annually. So let's say the water use in 2017 was only reported in July of 2018, so a couple of weeks ago. That means that the information that we have reported from the people who are either measuring it or estimating it is given to us in the middle of the following crop year. And because there's so much variability in the system, that's too late to be of significant use. And so when you're planning your agricultural use, when you're planning restoration, we need to get better information closer to real time. So a lot of people recognize that. We pulled together a group that came to be called the Coalition of the Willing because it was people who had an interest in it. We didn't want this to be another top-down study or a study that the state board or somebody else ordered and, came and the bookshelves groan with the weight of those studies. We wanted a study that built on the proof of concept, that took a realistic look at the challenges facing us in terms of understanding what's going on in closer to real time for crop water use. We wanted to recognize that the Delta is not a black box, that there are microclimates, and that makes a big difference in where and how water is consumed for crop purposes. And we recognize that there was a lot of work being done in this area, and there were a lot of new, promising, some proven, some conceptual methods for more accurately measuring Delta consumptive use. So those volunteers came together and agreed essentially to collaborate to try and figure out the problem. So we started out, before we hired anybody, before we developed a scope of work, we started out with some organizing principles. The first, and I think what turned out to be the most important one is the first one, that we had a broad array of stakeholders. We got lots of different people who cared about the issue from one or another or several different perspectives. We wanted to maintain credibility throughout the process, and we wanted to be neutral in terms of what we were going to find out. We wanted people who had a lot of interest and expertise at the table helping us to design the study from the beginning. We wanted to ensure that people stayed at the game by putting skin in the game. So we got funding from a variety of people. And actually, maybe the state board, the Office of the Delta Watermaster, was kind of the founding amount. But right behind us were the 3 Delta water agencies. The North, Central, and South Delta water agencies put money in up front because everybody recognized that in order to get at this, we're going to have more weather monitoring stations in the Delta. And those 3 agencies not only put up money to fund those weather stations, DWR agreed to take them on and to put them into the network, but the local water agencies also found the volunteers to host those facilities. So right from the get-go, we had meaningful involvement by the people who represent water rights and water use for crops in the Delta. We also decided that we wanted to focus on practical application. We thought a lot of the pure science had been done. There were really good models that had been developed over time from a lot of the educational institutions and from some of the agencies who'd studied this. We wanted to use that and find ways to improve it and make it practically available. And finally, we wanted to get the people who were doing this research together to feed off each other, to learn from each other, to understand how their methods differed and how they might improve each of them. So we were not looking at having a beauty contest and picking one. We wanted everybody to get better. We wanted everybody to understand what the challenges that each of them were facing and to demonstrate some of the ways that they got around out. And that was probably one of the most useful things that came out of the study was the peer-to-peer review. Serious scientists who knew their stuff really well, in rooms together, hashing it out. So these are our financial sponsors. These are all the people I said, a lot of people with skin in the game who cared about this for one reason or another. I won't go through all of them except to note that the Delta Protection Commission was a participant along with the Delta water agencies and some of the other state agencies that are listed there. And then the research participants. As I said, we reached out pretty broadly. So in addition to UC Davis, the Center for Watershed Science, University of California at Merced, the Land, Air, and Water Resources at UC Davis, UC Water at Berkeley. So we had a lot of UCs, but we also had Cal State Monterey Bay, NASA Ames Research Center, the Irrigation Training and Resource Center from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, USDA Agricultural Research Service. Land IQ did the first Delta-wide instantaneous land use surveys using satellites. So a big, big improvement. And starting with the work that was done in 2014, then we took it on 2015 and 16. Thanks to some of those volunteers that you saw on the prior page, we were able to keep field equipment in the field during 2017, and we've got that work going on now in 2018 with a follow-on study. So we've now got this full snapshot of the Delta every one of the last 5 summers, and that's why we came to the understanding of how dynamic the land use is. So I'm going to, at this point, turn it over to the smarter guys who are going to tell you what actually happened when we got into the study. So Jesse, you're up next.
Michael. Thank you, commissioners, for having me here. So as Michael said, we wanted to have a separate sponsor for each of these 7 different estimation methods that we are comparing in this study. And this included 2 models from the Department of Water Resources, as well as 5 models that use remotely sensed satellite data, aerial imagery taken by satellites, and other measurements that are taken remotely. And those were based out of research institutions and academics. And then we combined that with a field campaign run by UC Davis Land, Air, and Water Resources to implement some of these weather stations to directly measure ET on the ground at 14 locations in the Delta in 2016. And then we also had the land use surveys for each year that give a wall-to-wall picture of how land is being used in the Delta and what specific crops are being grown in which areas. And so those can tell us a variety of things about consumptive use in the Delta, and then also just about land use trends in the area as well. And that was provided graciously by DWR with some quality control, and really allowed for collaborative learning between all of these participating groups. And then the Center for Watershed Sciences acted as kind of a corralling group that collected data from each of the models and independently analyzed it to produce our final report. So we really combined blind tests of these models where the modelers themselves, the academics and folks, were not making these comparisons. It was a separate group, and common data sets wherever we could between the models, and collaborative learning through meetings and improvements of methods throughout the 2 years of the study to benefit the results that we got out of it. So the primary findings of the study, we were largely focused on agricultural lands, which make up about 60% of the Delta. The ensemble mean of all methods, so this is the average, evenly weighting all 7 of them, put us at right about 1.4 million acre-feet per year of consumptive use from crops in the Delta. And that did decrease slightly in 2016 due to certain land use trends, but it was right around that number for both years. And the accuracy of all methods in estimating that amount improved with this collaboration. We released an interim report 1 year into the study, which was a completely blind comparison where all of these folks submitted their estimates without kind of learning from the group. And the second year, where they were allowed to submit updated estimates with improved common data sets and improved methods, that brought them all within 11% of the mean average. And in many cases, they were less than that. That was the largest deviation. So there's very good agreement on the overall amount of water used each year in the Delta. But there were some systematic differences between these models. They have certain assumptions built into them. Some of them require individual judgment from the people running and operating them. So there are some differences that will always kind of inherently exist based on how these estimates are made. But nevertheless, remote sensing done by these satellites and made by these different methods provides a really reasonably reliable basis for remotely estimating consumptive use in the Delta and elsewhere from crops. And that science is advancing rapidly. We have new satellites that are being launched every year that are increasing the frequency and the resolution of these satellite observations that can really exponentially increase the applications of these models worldwide. But the models do differ, certainly in the expertise required to run them, the costs that have been incurred to develop and maintain them, and then also the resolution and the frequency with which they can produce results and these estimates. And then moving beyond the crops a little bit, it was not a primary focus of the study, but the land use data did give us information about non-cropped, non-managed areas that includes things like riparian zones, open water, urban areas, upland, non-irrigated pasture areas, and by unit area, the ET from those areas was typically much higher than that for agricultural lands. And so a significant portion of consumptive use in the Delta is likely occurring from these non-managed, non-agricultural lands. And there are some important policy implications that come out of that. So from there, I will hand it over to Jay to talk about some more of our conclusions and policy things. Thanks.
So I'm here to introduce some of the policy implications. I have to tell you that I shouldn't be here. It should be Josue Medellin, who's a professor at UC Merced, who really did much more work on this, and I'm just taking some of his glory on this project. So talk a little about some of the policy implications or potential implications of this work. We can estimate ET at the field level. Actually, one of our problems is we have too many methods for estimating ET at the field level. There's an old saying that used to apply a lot, it's harder now, is a person with one watch knows what time it is, a person with two watches is never sure. We had 7 watches to compare on this, and if you look back in your slides, you'll see that the numbers were a little different, and as Jesse said, they were about 11, it was plus or minus about 11% from the average. So that's pretty good for evapotranspiration estimates, but 11% of that 1.4 million acre foot of ET in a drought at $1,000 an acre foot, market value of that water south of the Delta, that's a lot of money to somebody. Okay, so scientifically, there's some uncertainty, just reasonable. And as government agencies, and the poor Watermaster here has to figure out how you all want to deal with it. We're just here to tell you that any number is wrong. Are these estimates close enough for government work, in a sense? So how we have to do problems with mass balance and estimates all the time in our work in managing a water system. How do we reconcile this so that we can get on with life and we're not always fighting about what the estimates are? What's the value in the process of having different units of government coming together and agreeing on a set of numbers? I sometimes tell people that this is a problem of, sometimes you get into a problem where there's the right way, the wrong way, and the Army way. There's a reason why it's the Army way. Well, sometimes in estimating water balances, we have a similar kind of thing. We say, well, we know there's errors in the numbers that we're going to get, but we're going to accept this agency's procedures and methods for coming up with that number. And maybe we'll update it over time in a reasonable way. And then another question I think that comes up, an implication is, how do we want to take scientific research and apply it usefully, not just in an ivory tower sense, to being practical and helping resolve what could be an estimation problem that has so many millions of dollars worth of error in it that you'll just be attracting lawsuits unless you organize that discussion in a reasonable way. And then how can the policy encompass these uncertainties, essentially? And then I think the question for the farmers and the irrigation districts in the area here is, how well can these estimation methods correlate to diversions, which is what the state board is charged with regulating and in terms of the water rights system. So there's a lot of interesting implications that come out of this. So what's next? We have a wonderful data set. We've got 7 methods every 30 meter by 30 meter pixel in the whole delta for 2 or 3 years. We've got field data. We've got 7 methods. It's just a wonderful data playground for those of you that like this stuff. And Jesse can give you another talk later on in comparing some of these data and these estimates with with water right diversions as reported. So that's one of the problems we have at the university is just because the money runs out doesn't mean we stop working. At least the graduate students don't stop working because they're great people. We need to have a little bit more research to develop some useful comparisons for fallow fields. Certainly this is of an interest for farmers and the state board when people propose to fallow a field and sell the water to somebody else. It's important to come up with a reasonable estimate on what that is, and some field pilot studies are underway for that. And then an issue that came up was the estimation of the non-crop water use. So we're restoring some wetlands. Well, a wetland, you think that evaporates some water? Quite possibly. How does that get estimated and put into the water balances that tell water right holders how much water is available during a drought year? Okay, so most of the methods that we look at are developed for crops, because that's the biggest commercial use of this stuff. But we have appreciable wetlands that people are expecting to expand, so that's another area. There's some nice work, applied work called OpenET that's sponsored by Environmental Defense Fund that's looking at quite a range of ET estimates for the whole state, actually for the whole West, I think, and comparing them. And we'll get back to that multiple watches problem with their data too, but it gives you some insights as to how likely the numbers are likely to be. And then there's the hypothesis, I guess, that can we use remote sensing to augment or maybe to some degree substitute for direct diversion measurement in the Delta and the rest of California, because the issues we have here in the Delta really are the same, very similar to elsewhere. And that's really one of the motivations of the study in the whole. So with that, any further questions for all of us?
All right, thank you for the presentation. Are there any questions? Presentation? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I have a question. It's very interesting looking at all these different models and how close you are to arriving at a consensus. But great, you have a measurement, or you will have a measurement method pretty quickly. What do you see as some of the practical uses of this information?
Well, so Jay mentioned one that I think is a big motivation for a lot of people, is that we may get information that will allow us to leapfrog the very complicated, error-prone, untimely, expensive process of measuring every diversion in the Delta, which is what the law currently requires and what I'm working on implementing in the Delta. That's a very difficult problem to deal with, and this may be a way of not only avoiding those problems, but of actually getting more useful, more timely information that we can use. So that gets to the question, how do we use it? What can we do with it? Well, first of all, for farmers to know and understand what their crop consumptive use is and to use the information that's available to help them get bigger yields, make more money, et cetera. And that's really why the CIMMYS network was set up in the first place. It's to give information to farmers that allows them to make better decisions, including better decisions, not just with water, but with their fertilizers and their pest control and all that kind of stuff. So this suite of information can be extremely valuable for the farmers.
So by having this measured at the field level, you can tell this crop is much more water intensive than this crop, encourage them to maybe switch crops or plant less of this and more of that.
Well, that might be a use, but it also might be very useful to be able to predict a week out how much water you're going to need and to begin to choreograph with your neighbors when you take the water, not just turn on your pumps because the leaves look a little peaked today. So that kind of intelligent information loop during the irrigation season back to the farmers, that's kind of the holy grail. And from my perspective, with responsibility for administration and enforcement of water rights in the Delta, actually being able to correlate what's happening in the fields during the year is really important. And as an example of that, when you try and make this correlation between the water you divert and the water that's actually used, it may be that in the delta, what really matters to management of the system is the water that's leaving the system, because the delta is fairly unique. There's no storage, no seasonal storage, and even if you over-divert, even if you use more water than the plant uses, it returns to the system in space and time pretty closely to when it goes out. So it may make less difference in terms of managing the system what you divert if you've got a better and more real-time handle on what's being used.
Oh, great, thank you.
Thank you, George. Any other questions? Chuck?
Well, I appreciate the report and certainly the information, because it's obviously valuable for future predictions. But in discussions of water, there's always more than one consideration as to use. Obviously, agriculture is one, the environment is the other, and certainly urban use is the third usually that's talked about. And the question arises is there's a lot of debate in regards to the, for example, the SEDs that we're talking about with the increased flows.
I've heard of them.
Is there a system in place to measure the amount of water that is increased in the flows in the delta for the environment, for the fish, et cetera? And have we been able to capture those amounts to determine whether those increased flows or the water that's used has actually delivered the benefit to the environment that we hoped for? Because there's a lot of information in regards to, the amount of water, but there's really no benefit to the fish, the salmon, et cetera. So again, is there a system in place to monitor those waters? Or if not, is there the potential for, as you've done with the agriculture, to find a way to measure those uses of water to make sure that we're maximizing that water for that particular use as we're trying to maximize it for agriculture?
It's a much more difficult problem, and the honest answer is that we don't have fully developed or mature ways of making those monitoring decisions in real time. It's harder when you're talking about critters that are not visible from the satellite, when you're talking about the variety of things that are going on. But it's a real and a difficult question. The Phase 1 SED talks about flows from the tributaries and into the lower San Joaquin, and it ends at Vernalis. That's the beginning of where the Delta Watermaster has authority. And so on the one hand, more water of a higher quality at the doorstep of the Delta seems like a good idea, good thing, probably has benefits for lots of different things. But the fact is, we're actually delivering more water and maybe more fish with that water to the killing fields, because the Delta is currently a non-hospitable place for fish to come and go through, or to live in, or to be reared in. And so how we figure out the suite of actions that are necessary to take, and then, to get to your point, how to measure the impact of whether it's increasing inundated floodplain, or reducing predation, or reducing the salt load that comes in, let's say, from the San Joaquin River, the amount of pesticides and herbicides that are in that water, and then the process of recirculating that water through the pumps at the southern end of the Delta. It's a gnarly, difficult problem. This is an important step forward. It helps us understand better what's going on in the agricultural area in the Delta on the land side. It doesn't really help us very much with those other problems about what's going on in the channels. There's a lot of work being done on that. a lot of research being done. This is important because it gives that research some understanding of what's happening on the land side and where and when the water is being taken out of those channels for these purposes. But one of the things you talk about practically what could happen here, instead of what we have currently, where largely throughout the Delta, and the exception of this is the big pumps at the south, but largely throughout the Delta, people make individual decisions about when and how to turn on the pumps and run their siphons. And this research holds the possibility of better choreographing that. So for instance, let's say the biologists tell us, let a big slug of water come down the river because we're going to either attract fish or help them get out. This kind of information would help farmers in the Delta to say, okay, lay off your pumps for a few days, or be ready for when that happens. So this is practical, useful information that has to be understood sufficiently so that we can start to make some decisions about how we could, if we want the ecology to get better, how farmers could help. Right now, it's not a consideration because they don't have the information.
I appreciate that. I guess one of the things that concerns me when we had the atmospheric rivers in the winter of 16 and 17, I represent San Joaquin County, so obviously we have a major portion of the Delta. But we estimated that we probably flushed in those particular months about 32.6 million acre feet of water that didn't benefit anybody, not agriculture, not the environment, certainly not urban users. And I guess the question is as you develop your different programs to capture the amounts used, I would hope that we would have an overall look at where all the water is going to make sure that we can better utilize it in the future, absent maybe some additional storage upstream to provide for the future.
So if I didn't offer him the microphone, he'd rip it out of my hands. Because I know from lots of discussion that he's got some points on that. But clearly the benefit of understanding what's going on in our whiplash system that sometimes is too short of water, sometimes has way too much, and we rarely have the Goldilocks moment where it's just right. But talk about wasting 32 million acre feet of water in 2017, Jay.
One of my favorite phrases to use around my environmental colleagues is wasted to the sea. I always try to say it with a smile on my face. We're going to have to manage this system more tightly. We've got a lot of demands we're placing on this system. We live in a dry place with a lot of activity, economic activity. We're rich enough that we want to keep the environment going. We just got to take more careful accounting of it all. And right now, we have sort of several loose accounting systems by different state programs and different water managers. This, I think the biggest contribution of this work, aside from the CIMA stations, which even if the rest of this work was nothing, it would provide people in the Delta with a lot better weather data for local operations. The biggest thing to me is we got all these, or Michael George got all these different agencies together to do something common technical. And we produced a final report, not a draft that nobody could ever agree to finalize, but a real final report. That doesn't happen very often, and I think that's a good first start for us coming up with a real accounting system for this place that will tell us, oh, well, sometimes a lot of our regulations really aren't going to matter, and so we don't need to mess with them. And sometimes they really do, and how do we best deal with that? So I'm really pleased with the way this turned out, but it is just a first kind of a step.
Yep, Commissioner Eddy, had a question?
Jay, thank you for being here. That's great to see you again. My question was more just like what you had mentioned, and also kind of the black box side. There's tons of research participants, an impressive group of research participants working on this study. Is this kind of the leading ET study in the state, in the Delta region, or what's happening outside the Delta region and the Valley, et cetera? And then if that does exist, how are the studies comparing?
So this is the leading research study in the Delta. It's the most recent study comparing these, so it's being picked up and looked at by a lot of people. Jay mentioned a process called OpenET. That's basically to take the science that's described in this report, that's been peer-reviewed and published and subjected to a lot of scientific rigor, and try and make it quickly, easily, understandably, visually available to real people. Put it on your iPhone. Have it on the seat of the truck in the field and be able to call it up. It's called OpenET. It's a fully funded 4-year project that's got lots of really smart people from all around the world working on it. And within government and making government accountable for rigorous science and applying it. That's the promise of getting, the State Water Resource Control Board, the Delta Stewardship Council, the Delta Protection Commission, the Delta Conservancy, the Metropolitan Water District, the Department of Water Resources. Imagine a world in which we could all agree on the measurement of crop ET, not just in the Delta, but everybody understands the Delta is the gnarliest, most difficult, most changeable place. So imagine you had that statewide. And now imagine you had it as you were trying to implement the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act.
Exactly.
So as Jay says, we know there is not enough water in the system in most years to serve all needs. It's a very tough decision, sets of decisions that we've got to make about how we're going to organize to get the most benefit out of the water that we've got in the system. This is a really important tool, and the key is to get it out of the ivory tower that Jay represents and get it into the iPhone that the farmer has in his pocket, or that the regulator has in his pocket.
Well, yeah, and that's where it's on the local GSA side. I think it becomes, that could be thorny quickly.
And they're going to all need to reconcile their accounts.
Yeah.
And to have a common way for them to reconcile their accounts ought to make the difficult discussions easier.
Because the discussions will be about the tough issues about allocation and water right priorities and all that kind of stuff, but hopefully much less on, I don't believe your data, it can't be as bad as you say.
All right. Any other questions? I did have a quick question for Jay. I think one of your slides you mentioned the fallowing pilot, and I'm just curious what you're hoping to learn from that briefly. It just sparked my interest.
He's out of it. So one of the things that Jesse and Josue and the other members here said, we could not, in the 2-year study that we did, we didn't have enough data that we could make meaningful comparisons between fallowed fields and crop fields. So recognizing that, more research needed, we actually have a research program in the field this year where we've got, first of all, full satellite review. So we're putting to use what we learned in this study, but we're also putting field equipment in 7 pairs of fields, 14 pieces of equipment, and in 7 different places they're paired. So one where we got volunteers, farmers in the Delta are helping to pay for and manage this process. So they'd clear a field, they'd keep it weed-free and drained and fallowed. So they're giving up revenue that they could otherwise generate from that field for the purpose of research. And right next to it, similar equipment in a crop field. So you'll have a fallowed field in tomatoes, a fallowed field in alfalfa, a fallowed field in corn.
So I think that maybe you answered my question. So the question wasn't, I guess, so what you're saying, what I hear you saying is this, the fallowing is by design as part of the pilot versus identifying areas that have been fallowed, because you mentioned, and selling the water further south. And so that generated a different thought.
Yeah, no water transfers going on. This is pure research.
I heard something different, maybe. Okay, all right.
Yeah, but we got farmers who agreed to provide us a fallowed field to keep it clean, keep it drained, and allow us to put equipment on that field and on the crop field next to it. There's no water transfers involved in this. Obviously, there are people who are interested in this to figure out whether there are opportunities for water transfers through fallowing, but there's also the other side of the coin. Some of the farmers who are in there are saying, I think my fallowed field probably ETs about as much water as my crop field, so why bother me about fallowing the field if it doesn't really save any water? We're getting at that issue.
Got it. All right, very good, that's helpful. Yes, sir. Mr.
Now,
Lombolini.
what is the most frequent satellite passage over our area now?
The ones we've been using are 2 weeks, I think.
16 days.
16 days.
Now they're going to 8 days. The second set of satellites has
And
gone
there's
up.
something going up on the space station, I guess.
Right.
huh?
And you can fly an airplane over it
No, I understand that.
or a drone as frequently as you'd like on whatever scale.
Oh, Dante's got a drone. He's working on this.
Okay.
He's part of our research team.
It stopped working for me.
Operator error.
I think so, but program problem. Anyway,
Are there
thank you.
any other questions? All right, thank you, gentlemen, for the
Thank you.
presentation. Yep, very good.
Mr. Vice Chair, public comment?
I'm sorry?
Public comment?
Oh, yes, we don't have any slips to speak. Is there anybody that wanted to comment on the presentation that we just heard? I don't have any slips, so we see nobody coming forward, so I'm assuming not. That takes us to item 8, which is the Delta sign plan. So I think Stacy was going to present that.
I like how this is starting out.
Wants to retire. There you go.
Thank you. Commissioners, thank you for having me. I'm Stacy Hayden, the Information Officer at the Delta Protection Commission. And I'm just really pleased to be here today to share something that has been a collaborative effort between a lot of people that is now done and ready to go. Definitely not a report that's going to sit on the shelf. We have lots of plans for this. And it is the Delta Sign Plan. This plan, as I mentioned, is a collaborative project between a lot of people. First and foremost, the Delta Marketing Task Force, which is a group of people and businesses in the Delta who live and work in the Delta, organizations in the Delta, as well as agencies, in particular a partnership between the Conservancy as well as the Delta Protection Commission. This project was funded by the Stewardship Council as part of their work with Delta as Place. So the idea of this plan was that there's been a number of surveys that have occurred throughout the Delta in the past, particularly around like recreation and tourism and identity. And two things have often come up. One, that there is not adequate signage in the Delta to figure out kind of where you are and where you're going and to catch people's attention. The other one being that the Delta hasn't had a strong singular identity as a whole. And so that's been worked on through various projects between the Conservancy and the Commission with the National Heritage logo, Visit CA Delta, and other projects. And this project also blends with the projects that have already been put out there already. So this sign plan is actually about 35 pages long. I'm not going to run through all of that for you today. I just want to focus on a few highlights. And it is available on the Visit CA Delta website. I hope you'll have a chance to take a look at it. Not only did we have that partnership happening, but we really wanted to make sure that the Delta community really had a strong voice in this plan. We did do 5 public outreach sessions. We did a 30-day public comment period. We also reached out to various other Delta counties and organizations directly, aside from the 5 community events that we had, and we spent some time with Caltrans as well. This sign plan is meant to kind of provide some consistent design for different types of signs that can be used throughout the Delta. So regardless of where you might be, you'll start to see some of the same kind of imagery and hopefully get a sense that, if you're in Pittsburgh or Locke, how that relates to the Delta as a whole. One thing that we really, really want to stress about this plan is it's meant to be a guide, not a directive. If someone's putting in a sign, they do not have to use this. But the idea here is that if somebody wants to put in a sign, or an agency has funding, or a nonprofit has funding for interpretive signs, something along those lines, there's already been a lot of research done in this plan that's presented, and there's already been some community agreement on, what the Delta community feels would be good for design templates and for kind of a consistent branding throughout the Delta. So this plan's available for anybody who wants to not start from scratch whenever they're trying to do some signs. And we also really want to emphasize that we're not trying to replace or take down any current signs. There are signs in the Delta that are out there, and we really tried to keep those in mind when we were thinking even about the color and design of some of these new templates as well. There was a focus on 4 different types of signs, because there's a lot of different types of signs we could talk about in this plan, but we really wanted to try to pinpoint some things that we feel could be cohesive and have some impact right away. The first being the welcome and orientation signs. That's really greeting visitors. You're typically going to find those kind of on the exterior edges of the Delta boundary. There's wayfinding signs. So those are the signs you see as you're going down the road that tell you how many miles or turn this way for a historic site. Often those are going to be connected more towards Caltrans type signage as well. Then we have place marker signs. So if you're standing at a bridge or you're standing in a town, you can look and get the information that you want right there. And then there's interpretive panels. So those tend to be kind of the bigger signs that you would see at places like Big Break Regional Shoreline that share a little bit more detailed information about a specific place or event or some other aspect of the area in which you'd find that sign. So I'd like to walk you through a little bit some of these design templates and the ideas behind them. Our first set of signs would be the welcome and orientation signs. These are generally going to be bigger signs. You're looking at least 6 feet, either vertical or horizontal. When we were talking about the designs with the community and with the contractor, we were thinking about the current Welcome to the Delta signs that also have this kind of silhouette aspect to them. But something we really wanted to do, because even though we're trying to create some consistency in the visuals, we also know that the Delta is very unique depending on where you're standing. And so the idea of interchangeable graphics within a consistent background was something that we were going for. So for instance, if you're in the North Delta and you see this sign, you may not see sandhill cranes, maybe you would see something else. If you're in Antioch, maybe there would be, some other kind of graphic here. So these are the large wayfinding signs, and I will talk about what's going to happen with these, because there are plans to actually move forward with these signs at this point. These are your wayfinding signs. So you may find, for instance, the ones on the left, maybe even directly on freeways. And then there's other opportunities to place wayfinding signs throughout the Delta as well. We're working on the same thing here, where the other signs had interchangeable graphics. The idea was to have this consistent signage, but also have iconography that could be then switched out to really showcase whatever is offered uniquely in that area. Some of these icons are pretty special. For instance, the Delta community icon there, that was actually developed by one of the Delta leadership program classes. So we worked on trying to get some of their efforts in and work on this. The other nice thing about this graphic is we do have the Visit CA Delta website. We're going to have all of these different signs. We have a recreation map that's currently in the works as well. So people will start to see this iconography and see those other graphics kind of dispersed through various different kinds of material, again, lending to that consistent identity that we're trying to give the Delta as a whole. Now, we're not saying that we want every area and absolutely everything to mesh with this. Of course, cities and towns all have their uniqueness to them, but this does help fulfill a gap that currently does exist, which is that lack of the consistency. So next we have the place marker signs. The thing that was really important for us here with the place marker signs is when you stop into Walnut Grove, for instance, and you're looking at a historic building, or you're just in Walnut Grove and you've never been here before, or maybe you've been in the Delta, but you probably just, didn't even realize you've been in the Delta. If you're standing and looking at a bridge, you're in a town, you're at a historic site, you can actually begin for the first time, especially if you're new to the area, that this wonderful little town you're in, this great building you're looking at, is in fact part of this larger whole, right? This Delta as place, this whole consistency. So this map concept actually translates through as well to the interpretive panels. So if you're out at Big Break, or you're up in Clarksburg and you're reading an interpretive panel, again, you'll be able to get information about that area or what it is you're looking at, but you're also going to be able to understand that it's part of the Delta as a whole. I would like to share, there's been a lot of work and a lot of research done on the design themselves, but in the sign plan as well, it shares a lot of information about bases, about installation. So this plan's really comprehensive. For instance, the idea would be that a nonprofit is wanting to do interpretive panels. They can go look at this plan, not only have a design and templates that we have on the website that they can just pull off and fill in, but the research for what kind of materials they might need is also going to be there as well. Along with that information, there was also a lot of research done on locations. And we have various maps in the sign plan that show where current wayfinding signs are. There was a lot of discussion between the community members to talk about where some of the priority locations are for new signs, how that relates to where the current signs are. And there's other maps that also show where there's opportunities for place marker signs. So again, all of this has been researched, but also vetted by the Delta community who's attended the meetings and shared their comments in the public comment period. There's a lot of opportunity here, and we are going to start using this plan in a number of ways. We're actually starting right now. The Delta Conservancy is providing $74,000 to the commission. So we're currently looking at the maps right now of those proposed locations, trying to look at how they relate to the parcels, and then we're going to begin discussions on, what we're going to prioritize first so we can start placing some of those larger wayfinding signs on the edges of the Delta. DPC also has some interpretive signage as well. That's in the works with, I believe, Locke. There's a few, okay, that you are going to be able to utilize these templates. So you're actually going to start seeing these signs out in the Delta, which I think is really exciting. But the other step is for us also at the Conservancy to start going out to organizations as well and sharing this plan more. Because something that's nice about this plan is when organizations are trying to get funding, if they have a good plan already in place, it's going to be a lot easier for them to help get that funding. And we just want to make sure as many people as possible are aware of this, that it's a resource to use, and there's a lot of great information in here. So I wanted to keep it short for you today because there is a lot of information in the plan, but I wanted to give you a highlight. If you go to visitcadelta.com/signs, and you can take a look at the entire thing, not only are we going to have all of the templates up there that anybody could pull down and utilize, we're also going to have all the iconography, the graphics available. So again, it's just a great resource for the community. It's been a really wonderful process working with everyone in the Delta to put this together, and we look forward to continuing forward in helping to fill some of those gaps. Does anyone have any questions?
Any questions, Ms. Hayden? Seeing none, thank you very much for
Thank
all
you.
your work, and looking forward to seeing them out there.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Any public comment? Yes, sir. Going up.
I'm Jason Peltier from Walnut Grove, and there's another kind of sign that I think we should think about, which is safety signs, because we have a problem here. It's a new phenomenon, which is particularly on Fridays when people are going skiing or they're going to the Sierras. If they're in the East Bay, they get Waze tells them to come up 160. That's our theory anyway, because the Waze effect, as we call it, is sometimes stop and go from Ride to get through Walnut Grove. Now these foreigners that are coming through here, I don't say that in a derogatory way, this is a foreign place to them. They just say, Waze tells me to go there, I'm gonna go there. And I shudder to think about, I mean, whenever anybody is coming to visit us that hasn't driven in Delta, I say, I give them a little safety lecture before they drive, because it's different. And I don't know how we can communicate to those people. I'm surprised we haven't had more problems, but it's a very foreign driving environment and to those people, and just would flag that.
Jason, since you're up there, did you want to, I don't know, Eric, how long are you thinking your item is going to be? Because we have one more item, but since you're up here, you'd submitted a card here to speak on the Nutria, kind of an update on the status of that.
Happy to.
Okay, you want to do that now? Yeah, very good. Yep, perfect. But before you do that, I'd like to echo your sentiment regarding River Road driving, and I know every time I come out here, it feels as though either I'm driving the speed limit or it feels like I'm almost going backwards in light of how much tailgating I experience every time we come through the Delta. And so it's only getting worse, and I know that maybe the sign program isn't necessarily designed to address that, but at least give it some thought in the event that there's a need to remind folks about speed limits. In the event that they're going to slow down to read some of the signs, you're going to need to be able to actually slow down enough to do it, unless you're going to get out of your car. But it's a growing problem, no question. Yeah.
I'm also the executive director of the Coalition for a Sustainable Delta. It's an organization that started about 10 years ago, getting involved with the biological opinion litigation, funded primarily by farmers and water districts in the San Joaquin Valley. We've evolved to be more focused on collaborative science. We participated in the CSAMP and CAMP and all the interagency and other organizations on science. So I'm new, and we are expanding to get more involved with broader suite of Delta issues like making the existing system work for fish and people. It's something we have not put enough time and energy into. But here's an emerging threat, the nutria. The first one, I think it's been over a year. The first one was found down in the San Joaquin Valley. I know you've had a briefing on nutria, but I just wanted to update you on a little workshop we had in Stockton the other day. We joined forces with San Joaquin County Farm Bureau and KSN engineers. This idea of a workshop came out of what's going on, right? Is there enough going on? And I think, and I know Erik was there and Dante was there, and I think probably share my concern we all share this concern, I'm sure, which is if you look at the Chesapeake Bay experience, I think it took them like 15 years to eradicate the nutria. And the big lesson from there was hit them early and hit them hard. And we are really concerned, I think, out of that workshop, it even got magnified, about the current state of work being led by Cal Fish and Game. It was a great presentation. My hat's off to them. It's a big challenge for them when you look at the geographic scope, when you look at the behavior of the critters, and how difficult this can be to control them. But a couple of facts we learned was, so they have this huge area of surveillance of looking for nutria. It's from below Los Banos now to the South Delta where one has been found. They have two-man surveillance teams covering that entire area. They're training more. They're going to bringing people in on a rotational basis. But really, we don't know how many do we need? Like 100 teams? I don't know. But you know what? The bottom line for all of us has got to be: we can't, absolutely can't, in 2 years be saying we coulda, we shoulda, we woulda, you know, all these things, because they're given their behavior now. And Erik was at the workshop and is gung ho for the commission to do whatever it can to help. And I don't come with a specific ask, but you know the bottom line is we need resources, and we don't know how much yet. But I think this is a unique, maybe one in a million kind of issues where we've got people in the Delta, the fishery agencies, the water management agencies, and people that rely on exports, all with a single purpose here, and that's to not let the nutria get established, and in fact eradicate them. So I think we'll be successful in getting money, because any politician that sees that collective walk in and say, we got a problem and we got a need and we're united, is going to get the resources. But it'll be very expensive to surveil and eradicate. It's going to be horrendously more expensive and with much more of our ecosystem and our infrastructure at risk if we're not successful. You know, we look to Louisiana and Chesapeake particularly for lessons about nutria, because they've been fighting it also in Oregon. But their circumstances are so much different than ours. I mean, the levees around New Orleans, they're just super levees, right? They're flood control levees. We've got dams that got water against them all the time. So our level of vulnerability to burrowing is something beyond you can imagine there. So what I've done, I've kind of summarized in this two-pager, kind of what's the threat, what are we learning, what are we learning, what can we learn, talk about surveillance a little bit, eradication, resources needed, and coordination. And I don't have, Erik, you've given some thought. I don't know if you have what we could do. I met with the Delta Stewardship Council the other day, and I said, well, tell me about the interagency coordination group that Cal Fish and Game is running. We're not on it. We don't know. You know, so that was a red light for me right away, because it's not just Fish and Game, people in the field, contracting with USDA, Wildlife Services to do the extermination. It's communication roles that you guys in the Stewardship Council can have that are going to be part of it. So, thank you.
Great, thank you. And maybe on that note, Erik, I mean, I think it's certainly within our purview to ask the question of what is happening in light of the impending threat that the rodent poses to the Delta. And so I think it would be an appropriate request at this point, or staff direction, or direction to staff, to at least ask the question, what is the status before the bad situation gets worse, so that we're at least aware of it. And I don't know how you want to proceed with that.
Well, I would say one thing, Mr. Chair, and you know, and it's a little bit of a subtle role we can play. Obviously, we're not going to be out there trapping or dispatching, I guess is the right word, nutria, but we can certainly play a role in strategizing and how to make this thing work better, and Jason's absolutely right. I think there's a lot of good thinking that can get inserted into Cal Department of Fish and Wildlife. I know they take this seriously. We're mainly working at the program manager level so far, and so I know sometimes there's pointed questions asked of those people that they're not really in a position to answer. And I'm assuming, and I hope I'm not doing that inappropriately, but I'm assuming that as you move up to the executive level of Cal Department of Fish and Wildlife, that they're really thinking through these same things as well. But we can certainly be there to remind them of that. And so there is a coordination effort to play. I know Cal Department of Food and Ag is part of that coordination team. They have a very important role to play with Fish and Wildlife. I'll continue to work with Jason and others to make sure that we're best strategizing the council as well on how we can ensure that we have the necessary resources to really hit this problem and hit it hard, as he said.
Commissioner Malini?
Yeah, I attended the same meeting with Jason and Erik, and what struck me was the person leading the program was struggling to develop a basis for a request of funding. And they were talking about getting an experience from a two-member team as to how much area they could cover and how much they can do. And so until they get the team in the field with an adequate period of time and redundant review, they can't make an estimate as to what they need in terms of resources. Now, some of us take a different approach towards funding than that, and they're trying to build this team from employees and positions that they don't yet have in their agencies. And that alone is going to take quite a bit of time in order to get through your bureaucracy, the request for additional positions. So I was pretty disillusioned at that. We have little red dots on a map where they saw some of these things. And I would think, I know what we're going to do with our local districts is we're going to concentrate on trying to get our people tuned up on how to identify or whatever, and that they have a video training program that they haven't put on the site yet. At the meeting, I requested they put it on their site so we can refer people to it to learn more about how you identify the animal and what is available, and try and get some local effort going. But the area is so vast that if you don't go after those spots where you've already seen them and you're going to make a complete review, it's going to be well out of hand before that's ever accomplished. So anyway, I think if we can get the data out and get the local people, whoever's in the field, we have local people, the cities have local people in some areas, the county, whatever. And we had an example in Lathrop where the animal control officer netted one of these things about 4 or 5 blocks away from the river and took it back and released it in the river. So that's just a matter of education, that if we could get a little bit of that done, but we're going to have to do it. Fishing and wildlife is so structured that it's going to be difficult for them to get mobilized fast enough, I think. Anyway, that's it. Commissioner Eddy, did you have something to add?
I think, and I apologize, I was not here for the last meeting where there was the presentation by Fish and Game, but I think if the commission, I would encourage them again to reach out to Fish and Game to kind of provide that presentation and maybe even provide examples of other invasive pests that they've dealt with to kind of understand how the structure works. Because just from like the Department of Agriculture, there's a certain kind of structure that's in place that addresses pest infestations, what's done, how surveys, all that is done in coordination with also the federal government in a lot of cases as well. So I think if that wasn't explained clearly at the last mission by some of the representatives from the agency, maybe working with resources and CDFA, we can get a presentation that kind of goes more into those details of where we're at and what the challenges is that we see out there. The state also has an invasive species a council. I know that I think they have addressed this in the past as well, and that's another forum that the commission can turn to as well.
Now that we know that we have an insider,
That's right.
maybe you
If I
could
could, I
take the
should
lead
add
on
that,
it.
the Conservancy gave almost $2 million to Fish and Game to start funding things, but that's helpful. The thought I would leave you with, though, is we could wake up tomorrow and this story could be totally different. I mean, if they find that they're kind of pack animals, and if they find a pack of them somewhere, and there was a report of one in West Sac. There's been a lot of misreporting, but we could wake up tomorrow and we could have a total all hands on deck kind of an experience, and we ought to be ready for that.
Well, Jason, thank you for those too.
All right. Rid of that. So that, then, thank you very much, Jason, for that. So item 9, Eric, how long are you thinking you're needing with item 9?
I'll be pretty brief on this, certainly if there are any questions, but a lot of this is really what people have been picking up. I don't think any more than initial 10 minutes perhaps, and I can keep it briefer than that, Mr. Chair.
Right.
So this is an update on California WaterFix, and I'm sure most commissioners are aware that on Tuesday of this week, the department released their draft supplemental EIS. The staff report is really intended to provide you at least our first glance through reviewing the administrative draft, which had been out prior. Of course, this staff report was completed last week before we knew the release date for, well, I was told the release date would be July 17th, and lo and behold, it was. I was also told it was suggested to me that the comment period would be 30 days. That is an incorrect number in the staff report. It was released with a 60-day comment period. More time is always better when it comes to California WaterFix. So 60 days is a much better comment period than 30 days. Just to be very brief on this, and again, I'm probably covering ground that most everyone knows. The last time the commission was briefed on this tunnel project, it looked like it was pivoting toward a single tunnel instead of 2 tunnels. Subsequent to that briefing, Metropolitan Water District made a substantially larger funding commitment to proceed with 2 tunnels. That was joined by a funding commitment from Santa Clara Valley Water District. So state water project contractors, and actually Santa Clara is a federal contractor as well, both. But Santa Clara being the sole exception, but otherwise all the funding commitments had come from state water project contractors. Aside from Santa Clara with its dual set of hats, there's yet to be a funding commitment from a agricultural contractor in the Central Valley project. But with these funding commitments, primarily the extraordinary one from Metropolitan Water District, plans are proceeding with, again, a 2-tunnel plan. The supplemental EIS, which I thank Virginia Gardner of our staff for doing a real quick and deep dive into that document, and I'm sure we will find that the public draft is mirroring this exactly. She outlined with bullet points some of the primary changes. Suffice it to say that they're not substantive changes. If you're in the town of Hood, it's very substantive because it relocates activities still with grave impacts, obviously, from being in the midst of a never-ending, what will seem like a never-ending if this does go through, construction effort, but realign tunnels to at least avoid severely damaging a lot of structures in Hood, still dividing the community, however, with the proposed revision. Slightly worse impacts to agriculture. those impacts are still significant and unavoidable, and so there will be proposed mitigation. At Byron, at Clifton Court Forebay, the site of the, we'll call it the fish-friendly water forebay, because that's where the tunnels would deposit the water, would be moved to a site closer to the town of Byron, away from the northwest corner of existing Clifton Court Forebay. So changes of that nature, we will take a closer look. We do plan to prepare a comment letter on behalf of the commission. Given the public comment deadline on that, it will be days before our commission meeting. I think our comments are going to be along the lines of what they have been previously. Some of those previous substantive comment letters have been presented to the commission for approval. We could certainly do that in this case. We'd be missing the official public deadline, but I'm sure that the comments would still get into the record. Or we can just submit a comment letter under my signature on behalf of the commission staff. So that's happening on the one hand. We learned yesterday, if not the day, I think it was yesterday, that DWR submitted a certificate, a draft certification of consistency with the Delta Plan. They submitted that to the Delta Stewardship Council. It's called a draft certification of consistency because there is a provision in the DSC process where if you're not a public agency that holds public meetings, you need to submit a draft of your certification before you officially submit it. What that means is that anytime after 10 days, DWR can release their official certification of consistency with the Delta Plan. It's anticipated that will look almost verbatim to what they submitted as draft. It's not clear whether the council will be strongly discouraging them from submitting in 10 days and beginning a clock ticking on various proposed deadlines. I don't have a good update for you on those particular deadlines, but suffice it to say, it will be appealed. It won't just be accepted. Someone will appeal it. And then once the appeal is filed, there's a timeline that begins from that point there. So the clock could start ticking soon, but it's not going to be something that the council makes a final determination on before several months down the road, probably at least 3 months at the lower end of the spectrum. And of course, things can be delayed further. We do intend to comment. This is something I would like to bring back to the commission and have the comment from the commission, the formal comment letter from the commission, similar to the very substantive comments that the commission made on the initial EIR, EIS for both BDCP and CA WaterFix. I don't see any reason why we can't pull that together for the September meeting, assuming that we have an actual official certification that DWR provides to the Stewardship Council prior to that date. In the meantime, we'll get working on this, working off of their draft, assuming that that will be pretty consistent with what will be in their final. I will note the council sent around a notification today alerting the public that, among other things, they were going to prohibit any ex parte communication by council members, council staff. Those are the primary entities, consultants as well. From this point forward, so Chair Thompson, who is part of that, gets included within that as a council member by dint of his role as chair of the Delta Protection Commission. So just a reminder that that is now in effect, and that will certainly mean that our chair is, kind of cordoned off from others in terms of communication about this certification of consistency. There's some slight exceptions to that, but they're really technical and have to do with just information only, nothing substantive. So that was a lot to cover. It got even longer with this late-breaking news coming yesterday. The only other thing I will add is that I mentioned the funding commitments by the water contractors. The contractors also formed what's called a Delta Conveyance Design and Construction Authority. It's a joint powers authority. The acronym is DCA. That entity met for the first time on May 14th. They met just earlier this week, I believe. I think they have monthly meetings scheduled at a particular date and time, and those meetings are in Sacramento. Different people in the room, including some members of the commission, attended the initial meeting. So they're at least beginning their process where the JPA will be the entity that oversees both the design, which obviously there's a lot of that to occur still, but then the construction, should this project move forward. And then in the midst of all that, there's still an ongoing proceeding before the State Water Resources Control Board on the change of point of diversion. There's a lot of permitting still to complete, but this is something that probably will be a pretty substantive update every couple of months, at least for the next few commission meetings. So I'm happy to answer any questions if I'm able to, and we will be ramping up our CA WaterFix activity again. So.
Okay, are there any comments?
They're scoping out for the environmental document on the state water project contract amendments.
Yeah, and can you, Commissioner Nomalini, can you say a little bit more about that and the significance, because I know just that much about it?
Well, it's focusing on further loosening up the contract so they can facilitate more transfer of project water, which is not good from my viewpoint, but anyway, that's what it's intended to do.
Yeah, and we've not talked about that on the staff, and we will take a closer look at it. There's a lot of related efforts that are kind of in the greater WaterFix orbit. We've been a bit selective with which ones we intend to engage with. Just reading a one-paragraph description of that, my initial thought was maybe we wouldn't on this, but we'll take a closer look at it.
What's happened in the transition in the contracts, state water project contracts from the Monterey Agreement up to now, is that originally the so-called surplus water was not intended to be used anywhere where it would create a permanent demand. And they've changed that. So now you can create, I'm bringing you to conclusion, now you can create permanent demand on infirm water supply. That's what they're trying to do. And that isn't good, doesn't bear well for the state, I think, as a whole, particularly in Northern California. We'll be working on it.
Perfect. All right, any other thoughts or comments on the final item? Seeing none, we, yep, you got a public comment here, all right? Yeah, it's fine.
My name's Erik Vink. President of Hood. I came just to ask a quick question, Mr. Vink. In the plan for these tunnels, is there a methodology as far as to tie the volume of water that goes through the intakes to, say, maybe the snowpack or something else to where you have a good balance. Because in dry years, you're going to basically, if I have between 9,000 and 15,000, I'm going to want to turn that throttle up as much as I can for as long as I can to divert. So I'm just wondering, is there a control mechanism that'll be placed within this before we even start this project?
The real control mechanism would be the water quality standards that would need to be maintained in the Delta. We've got a lot of people that know a lot more about this. Michael George is shaking his head. So, of course, standards are not permanent. They can be changed. There's provision for relaxing them. But I believe that would be the top line restriction that would ensure that you're not operating that project to the detriment of the water quality standards.
So what you're saying is, in just a different way, if I have a dry year, if water is clean, but I have reduced flows going through the river, I potentially could maximize that 15,000 at each one of the intakes. There's that potential.
Well, again, the water quality standards have to do with the amount of water flowing through down the rivers and into the delta, and forming that salinity barrier. The bay's always dying to intrude in the void of fresh water coming down the rivers. So I'd be happy to catch you offline, but I don't know if that answers it. But
it doesn't. I was just wondering if there are control measures that we'll go ahead and do based on those.
Temporary urgency change.
Anyways,
yeah.
I'll talk
Anyway,
to you offline.
I'll
Thank
catch
you.
you afterward. But suffice it to say, there will be. I feel like I'm the proponent. I'm not the proponent for this. I'm just trying to explain to you the way it is intended to operate. There's a lot of concern out there throughout the Delta that it won't be operated the way it's supposed to, and that's
thank you.
probably the important lesson to take home from that.
Yep, of course.
But I'll catch you afterward.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, so see no other comments on the items before us so far. That takes us to item 10, is commissioner comments and announcements. Are there any announcements by any of the commissioners this evening? If not, that is it for our official business. We're looking for a motion to adjourn.
Actually, Mr. Chair, we don't need a motion to adjourn. You can take one if you wish. But might I just remind the commission members, the next meeting is September 20th in Stockton. You might recall in this same room about a year and a half ago, we had a presentation from PG&E about the McDonald Island gas field. There was a little issue they were experiencing at that time. The commission members expressed an interest in touring that. We plan to have that tour offered available before the meeting starts at 5:30 p.m. in downtown Stockton at Stockton City Hall. We'll be providing more information to you, but if that sounds like something you would like to do, please block out a little bit of time on your calendar, probably from 3 to 5 for the tour, maybe 3:30 to 5, that period of time. More to come on that.
All right. All right, no other comments? Then we are adjourned. Thank you very much.
Thank you.